Okay, well, welcome to Chapter 6. In this chapter, we're going to be discussing experimental control. So in the last chapter, we were talking about correlations, and one of the things that I overemphasized or belabored was the fact that just because two variables go together does not mean that one of them is causing the other. So, of course, the first thing that should have been popping into your head as a good student of research methods in psychology is, well, how do I establish whether one thing is causing the other thing? Well, that's what the function of an experiment is. So, how do we get control in an experiment? First off, whenever we run an experiment, we have to spend a significant amount of time designing the experiment. What that means is we have to figure out who our participants are. How are we going to select them from the population that we're going to try and generalize to? So let's be crazy in my example, and let's pretend like we want to do an experiment that would allow us to generalize to the entire American population. Okay, so we would want to select participants who, as a group, represent the characteristics that are present in the American population. So we'd want to make sure that we get the sex balance right. We want to make sure that we get the racial balance right. We want to get the spectrum of ages, starting at over 18, because for experiments we have to use people who are 18 or over, unless we want to go through a lot of trouble getting parental consent and stuff that only really developmental psychologists want to do. And so we're going to take all these factors into consideration to make sure that our sample, our group of participants, represents the population. So we have a lot of considerations that go into our selection. Now, I said we're going to do something crazy in my example and generalize to the entire American population. Hardly ever do researchers attempt to do that. Usually we select participants from the population that we have easy access to. So if you're a college instructor like me, I'm going to have a lot of college students serving as my participants because the selection is simpler. It's simply asking people, would you like to participate, and then they volunteer or not. If you're a clinician working with children with autism, you might focus on children with autism as your participants because you have access to them. It's easy to select them from the population of people that exist around you. So a lot of times our selection is going to be determined by who we have access to. Now here's an example of how medical researchers go about selecting their participants. First off, I'm going to use hopefully you guys can see whenever I gesture with my arrow, but you'll notice on this first branch it says opt-out recruitment, and then in the next branch it says opt-in recruitment. In medical research, a lot of the time the participants aren't actually being actively controlled or manipulated or having something done to them. A lot of times in medical research, the participants are going to be selected, and then they're going to be identified as having some characteristic or not, and then they're going to be followed over some period of time to look for some other characteristic to emerge. One of the ways that medical researchers get their participants is through sending out a notice saying, we're going to use your medical records unless you opt out. And you have to fill out a piece of paper and send it back and say, I don't want my stuff included. So that's what this first branch is. They used opt-out recruitment. In the second branch, they did what we do in psychology, which is opt-in recruitment, which is where you send a letter to potential participants and you say, we're going to be doing a study. If you'd like to participate, please fill out this form and then we'll contact you. And so those are people who have to literally volunteer to be in the study. And so they start out with 116 registrants. When they used the opt-out recruitment, they ended up with 105 people who failed to opt out. Now, does that mean they volunteered? Not exactly, right? Have you ever gotten stuff in the mail that you didn't really pay attention to because you didn't know what it was talking about, so you threw it away? A lot of times that's how I will include myself in this because it's possible that I've thrown stuff away that has been my notification that my medical provider was going to be doing some kind of opt-out recruiting, and my medical records might have been included in it because I didn't open the paper and see what it was. So when we see the opt-out recruitment produce 105 participants, I don't know if volunteer is the correct word for that. 8 people literally sent back the paper and said, I don't want to do it. And then of the 105 who responded, actually, there must have been 108 who ultimately had not opted out. Of the 108 who ultimately had not opted out, 3 of them were excluded because they had some characteristic that made them inappropriate for the study. So with opt-out recruitment, they ended up with a lot more participants, 105. With the opt-in recruitment, where they sent out the piece of paper and you had to respond back and say you wanted to participate, they only ended up with 40 respondents out of the 105 who were approached. Well, 116 who were approached. 40 said they would do it. 65 never responded to the query. So I would suggest that in this 105 participants who failed to opt out, was probably 65 of them who just don't respond to letters that were sent by their medical service. Of the 40 who said that they would do it in the opt-in recruitment, 37 turned out to be valid respondents. 3 ended up being people who had to be excluded for some reason. They were invalid for some reason. So using opt-in recruitment to, like we do in psychology, to try and lure participants into joining our study and responding to our questions and stuff like that, produces a lot fewer respondents than when you get the opportunity to use opt-out recruitment. Get 105 participants. As opposed to the 37 when 116 were approached in both strategies. So just a little window into why it's difficult for us to recruit and select participants in psychology, because all of our studies, unless you're doing research that's tied to something medical and you have the opportunity to do opt-out, we almost always have opt-in recruitment, where we have to advertise our study and then try and get students to volunteer for extra credit in their class, or try to get patients at a clinic to participate for some kind of reimbursement. I had a colleague who was doing research in a medical clinic, and it was opt-in research, but they were doing it on site at the medical clinic, and it was a survey about whether they use their mobile device for, is it a smartphone? Do you receive text messages to remind you when your glasses are ready to be picked up, that kind of thing. They got a grant. It was a small grant, but it was enough to allow them to give a $10 gift card to each participant to try and help encourage them to participate. Because a lot of times when it's opt-in and it's not students, you have to give them something. Students are great because we can give you extra credit and you guys will work for that. But for non-students, a lot of times we have to come up with something that'll make it worth their while to participate in our experiments. All right, so that's the skinny on selection. Let's go ahead and take a little break, and in the next segment we'll talk about how we assign participants to their conditions.